So prior to my time at Biosecurity New Zealand, I just introduced myself before, so I wasn't going to do that again, but I work in the Caulerpa team as a principal advisor. I started there earlier this year, and prior to that I was at Earth Sciences New Zealand, and I completed my PhD as a mature student just before coming back to Earth Sciences New Zealand as well. I guess I've always loved the ocean and capturing how special it is and sharing that with people. And from hearing all of your stories, that kind of truly cemented that actually seeing things with your own eyes and experiencing the ocean with your own eyes really drives you to want to protect it. So that's kind of what I'm talking about today. I'll also talk a little bit about how Biosecurity New Zealand is kind of supporting protecting our paradise. I won't go into a huge amount of detail there because there's people in this room that know a lot more about that than me. And I'll touch quickly on Exotic Caulerpa because I kind of think it brings the whole story together and it's what I get paid to do. So I guess I'm privileged, but also a little bit uncomfortable sharing my journey because I don't know, talking about yourself is always a little bit awkward. So I'm going to try and avoid that as much as I can. And also a lot of the people that are here in this room today have been a pretty big part of my journey and know kind of bits and pieces of it already. So it's nice to be talking to you today. But yeah, it's also one of those rooms where you're not the person that knows the most about a lot of this stuff. So feel free to fire some questions. I might redirect them to some of the people in the room. It's also kind of appropriate for me to be presenting here today. So my journey actually started in the top of the south. I did my master's through Vic Uni, but worked alongside Cawthron Institute and the Marlborough Mussel Company to look at predation on spat, due to mussel spat in the Marlborough Sounds, what feels like a lifetime ago now, about 20 years ago. After that, finishing my master's, I was actually finishing as I got a job at the old NIWA, Earth Sciences New Zealand, and I moved up to Northland when I did that. Obviously, Northland's kind of a diving and boating paradise, so I started spending a lot of time in the water, did a lot of diving, and really started taking up photography in Northland and capturing how special the area around my home was and really getting to know the area around my home and what makes it unique. I also did my scientific diver training at the time, commercial diver training, and became part of the marine high-risk site surveillance team, which Chris will tell you all about later, not about me being part of the team, but about marine high-risk site surveillance. And I guess you have to be pretty dedicated to be a biosecurity diver, and you guys that work in that field will know that. It's not diving in places like this a lot of the time. A lot of the time it's crawling around in the mud or under a wharf pile or a marina pontoon. And I guess you appreciate that, you know, well, the impact some of these pests can have and the degraded habitats that are out there alongside some of these incredible habitats that are out there. So it really drove me to want to make more of a change than just being part of that marine high-risk site surveillance team, which led me to applying for a job at Northern Regional Council, where I worked together with Kane and the marine team there. And we kind of got thrown into the deep end pretty quickly with Northland's biggest Sabella response at the time. So that's where I kind of learned a lot about, you know, responses, long-term management, some of the things that can go wrong and some of the things that can go right, but how important it is to work together in the marine biosecurity space. And I think I'm preaching to the converted when I say that for this group. It's not just Northland that's special, and we just heard that. You know, everybody here has got special places, but New Zealand is incredibly special. We have the 9th longest coastline in the world, and for a tiny little country like that, you know, that's crazy. We have between 15,000 and 18,000 kilometres of coastline, which, you know, we can't measure because there's so many little nooks and crannies around our coast. 80% of that is rocky shore, and despite, you know, Patrick's probably one of the people that did live as far away from the ocean as possible, but you can't live more than 130 kilometres away from the ocean in New Zealand. If you take into account kind of the outer limits of our EEZ, the Kermadec and subantarctic islands, our summer temperatures range, summer water temperatures range from 9 to 24 degrees. And we have this huge range of habitats, this big latitudinal range, because our country spans north to south, right? So we have a huge amount of niches and habitats for organisms to live in, which gives us this huge amount of biodiversity. And despite the fact that we feel like we're this kind of little island nation in the middle of nowhere, we are actually really highly connected to the rest of the world. And that's not just through shipping, because we're, as an oceanic island nation, we're reliant on shipping for the the export and import of goods, but it's also through current systems. So that means that we get a lot of visitors, not only human visitors, but organisms that turn up on our shores. Some of those are welcome. This is one of those welcome visitors, I guess. This is a green turtle at the Poor Knights Islands. We also get a huge range of tropical fish, and for the fishers and spearfishers in the room, we know that mahi-mahi and marlin and tuna are welcome visitors to our shores. But some of them are also unwelcome visitors. And because we are so connected and we have so many different niches, we're kind of uniquely vulnerable to a range of species turning up. We've also got about 1,400 species of fish in New Zealand. 300 of those are endemic. We've got more than 2,600 species of crustaceans, 1,000 species or more of seaweeds, and we're discovering more and more of those each day. And the reason I'm kind of driving this home is because sometimes we were so embedded in a response or a trialing a new control tool or long-term management planning or, meetings with stakeholders, we forget our why. Sometimes we measure our success on the number of organisms we've killed and the number of piles we've checked or the number of vessels that are clear or the hectares we've cleared with a tool. And I know that those are the kind of numbers and metrics that our funders and our ministers and people like that want to see. But for us to actually kind of reset and also communicate what we're doing to the wider public, I think understanding your why and understanding, the reasons that we're doing these things and what we're trying to protect is really important. And I think from speaking to hearing from everybody's stories in this room, we've got a good understanding of that. So while I guess I was in Northland and spending all that time in the water, like I said, I got to know my paradise pretty well. My specific place that I used to go to a lot was the Poor Knights Islands Marine Reserve. We were lucky to have a boat and we went out there pretty regularly. And I started seeing some of these changes happening, and within the space of time I was actually diving there. And you hear all these stories of, back in my day there was, crayfish everywhere and there was beautiful healthy kelp forests, and this shifting baseline is something real. However, during the kind of 10 years that I was diving at Poor Knights, I actually started seeing those changes for myself, and I think that really drives home. It's easy to hear stories and kind of put them aside, but when you're actually experiencing something for yourself, it's you really get invested in wanting to make change. Some of those major changes that were occurring up north were climate change related. So we're seeing declines in kelp forests, but also increases in subtropical urchins like Centris stephanus, causing barrens because they can now breed in the far north. And we're also starting to see more and more subtropical species turning up. And I guess this image here is like, there's nothing like being kind of immersed in a massive school of, snapper and healthy fish feeding frenzy getting bumped into to remind yourself of what it should be like. I guess I kind of set the scene for okay, we've got this huge coastline, we've got all this diversity, we've got these changes happening, we're connected to the ocean. And it seems like a pretty overwhelming kind of task. But we do have to remember that we also have New Zealanders that have a gigantic connection to the ocean. We have a huge resource in the fact that we have people that are connected to the ocean, have spent time diving, cruising, making a living from the ocean, and they have a huge combined knowledge, but also a large number of eyes in the water. And I think that when you really get to know a place, you really realize how special it is. And I guess as part of seeing that happening and seeing those changes happening, I got really curious about my paradise and took a pretty giant leap away from employment into a PhD for 3.5 years, which is pretty scary, but was something I was really passionate about. So I'm a massive fish nerd. So fish are kind of, I guess, my species, my group of species that I really love. And those species that I was talking about earlier, like the mahi-mahi and the tunas and those tropical species turning up in New Zealand, are really interesting to me. And getting a lot of reports about them increasing or starting to overwinter made me really curious about if that was actually happening. And at the time, I thought, oh, well, this is a big shift away from biosecurity, but there's actually quite a lot of parallels. We're kind of looking for my PhD, we were looking for species that were range shifting early in a range shift. The reason was a human-mediated reason, climate change. They were able to extend their ranges. And we're kind of looking for a needle in a haystack, like we are with a lot of marine pest incursions early on in the piece. So I tapped into that kind of combined knowledge of the ocean going public to collect data for this, because realistically I could have spent 12 years in a PhD trying to find one or two of these fishes and would never have an idea of what was actually happening in the space. So we worked together with not only some really highly respected marine scientists and fisheries scientists in New Zealand, but also divers, fishers, spearfishers that have been diving in a lot of these locations over the years, to ask them what was unusual, what was the setting now, what was the norm, and what was outside of the norm, so that we had a list of target species in certain locations where change was happening. And we got over 1,800 sightings records in the space of a year and a half, which just blew my mind, the level of engagement and how much people wanted to share their knowledge. And one of the really cool things that came out of my PhD was we identified 17 new to New Zealand fish species that had only been recorded by members of the public and had never been included in our diversity in New Zealand. And all of those were from images that recreational fishers or divers had taken. And when you think about every year that Te Papa kind of updates their fish records, there was maybe 3 or 4 new records going in. 17 was a huge amount, big jump. And what I guess I'm trying to get at is that, you know, tapping into that knowledge and really giving people recognition for what they know. It's messy data, it's difficult to do, but yeah, it's actually really valuable. And it also builds that kind of mutual relationship where people are really keen to share and work together. Once I finished my PhD, I got a position back at NIWA as a marine ecologist, this time working in the fisheries team. And that kind of coincided with COVID and the Caulerpa incursion at the same time. So we were based up in Northland, and we needed a team that was local during lockdowns to be able to go out and respond to the Caulerpa incursion. So I ended up leading the work, trying to identify where Caulerpa was, trialing some tools early on through that phase, getting chased down by the maritime police because they thought we weren't allowed to be out at Great Barrier Island at the time. And that's how I kind of stepped back into marine biosecurity. I guess I always gravitated towards it. We all know it's a challenging space, but it's really rewarding. And I think for me personally, seeing science in action and seeing those really applied results of some of the research you're doing, I find that really valuable. So yeah, ended up back in marine biosecurity after kind of a convoluted loop. Because of the belief that I could hopefully make more change and have more influence, I jumped over to Biosecurity New Zealand's Caulerpa team earlier this year. And I'm still learning the ways of biosecurity in New Zealand and MPI. What I do know is it's full of really passionate and talented people, and that there's a lot more politics that goes on behind the scenes than I was ever aware of. Many of my colleagues and collaborators are here today and probably know a lot more about biosecurity at MPI than I do, but I thought I'd give you a really quick overview of some of the wins that we've made. The major area that I guess MPI and Biosecurity New Zealand is responsible for is at the border. So we work to identify some of those potentially new pests that are going to be an issue for New Zealand, but also put in controls, because we all know that keeping a species out is a lot easier than trying to eradicate it once it's actually established. And New Zealand has been pretty proactive in the border space. We were the first to put in controls around biofouling and ballast water. And we know that shipping is one of our major pathways for the introduction of marine pests. We now also have a craft risk management standard, which you'll be really aware of. And one of our key programs at the border is the marine high-risk site surveillance, which Chris will tell you all about. Essentially, every 6 months, checking some of the most high-risk ports and marinas around the country. Of course, the border's not impenetrable. We have that 18,000 kilometres of coastline. We can't be everywhere at once. And we have had a whole bunch of things get through. And you guys will all be pretty familiar with most of these. Obviously, Sabella and Didymnum, Stiala, and the most recent is Caulerpa. And Biosecurity New Zealand works together with a whole range of stakeholders when we do get an incursion to minimise the impact of these species, but also hopefully slow the spread and reduce the density. And it's kind of the space where we learn a lot, right? We're able to develop tools, we're able to build partnerships, we're able to kind of work with stakeholders to make really big gains. And I think that's also the time when a lot of the public get really engaged in what MPI does. Another really key part of our role is what Jen does, and you guys will be really aware of that. Building those partnerships. It's where we kind of, I guess, ground truth what Biosecurity New Zealand is doing, make sure it's appropriate within the regions we're working in, and really build those partnerships to effectively manage marine pests, because it's not something you can do on your own. And we've got, you know, the Fiordland Marine Guardians. We've got the top of the south, obviously you're really aware of that, and then the top of the north came in a little bit later on. And all of those partnerships have been incredibly valuable for us to deliver work. The most effective part also for me, I think, is tapping into that, you know, ocean going public. That's particularly post-border is where a lot of our gains are. And I love the fact that the Protect Our Paradise campaign is tapping into not only don't do this, you know, this is a bad action, don't do this, but why are you doing it? You know, what is your paradise? And it's what we're talking about today. Because what we ask boaties and divers to do, and the members of the public to do, often is annoying. It's costly. It's not something they want to be doing. So tapping into their why, and then giving them the options for how to protect it, I think is a really effective campaign. And we certainly saw that with Caulerpa. So I know this is what we've all been waiting for, the Exotic Caulerpa response. I don't know how many times I've said Caulerpa in the last 5 years. So, but I feel like for me, the Caulerpa response kind of brings together a lot of what I've talked about to this point. It's about, it's very much embedded in protecting our paradise. Caulerpa has infested a lot of really high value marine ecosystems and locations. It's not one of those species that you really only ever see in a marina or on a wharf pile or in a degraded habitat. The first places that we actually found it were super high diversity and high value harbours and locations on offshore islands, which is really, you know, was different for a marine pest incursion. It's also our largest biosecurity response to date. So we've spent over 24 million on the Exotic Caulerpa response to this point. And we've made some massive gains. We have engaged passive and active surveillance. The initial Caulerpa incursion was actually identified by a member of the public that put it up on iNaturalist. So, you know, having people out there in the water looking for things is really important. We've had huge behaviour change campaigns and awareness. For a few years there, you couldn't get away from the cancer of the ocean, or the foot and mouth of the ocean, or the anthrax of the ocean, or whatever it got called in the media. And I'm sure most of you guys have heard about Caulerpa. We have currently a national strategy that was developed in partnership with industry and stakeholders, and that's about to be rolled out. We've had huge investment in tools, both large scale and small scale removal tools that are applicable across a range of species, which is, not just a gain for Caulerpa, but for other species as well. And a lot of people in this room have been actively involved in research around this species. Problem is, as with a lot of biosecurity responses, we're trying to learn about the species as we're trying to get rid of it. And, that's always a really big challenge. Caulerpa, Brachypus and Parvifolia were never particularly high on the list of species that were going to be a risk to New Zealand. Other species within the group, Taxifolia, Prolifera, would have been, but it hasn't got that kind of history behind it that we can learn from, although we can draw parallels, obviously, to other species. And we didn't know what it was going to do here in New Zealand. So we're trying to learn about biomass fluctuations and impacts while we're also actively minimizing impacts and removing biomass. So, that challenge of doing research and doing response at the same time is really interesting. What we have learned is that in patchy densities, the impacts of Caulerpa are nowhere near as high as we thought they were going to be. And in fact, biodiversity can be increased in some of those patchy populations. However, we haven't been able to test the impacts of these kind of large meadows because we've had really significant natural biodiversity, biomass decline of Caulerpa over the last year. These are locations where we know Caulerpa is. We know that the main pathway of spread to a lot of these locations is likely to be on anchor chains and human-mediated spread. So we've had a lot of gains in tool development to clean anchors, but also letting people know that that's the main way it's spread. And although we haven't had any new locations, new incursions since last summer, we have had huge biomass decline to the point of about 80 or 90% decline in a lot of locations. And we're trying to understand if that's something that's going to stay that way, how we develop tools when we've got low biomass to be ready if it does come back, how we understand impacts of these large mats without actually having those large mats present. So we're kind of pivoting and moving as we go. I guess I just wanted to give you an idea. That date on the side there isn't correct. This is actually one of the sites that I dived really early on in the Caulerpa incursion at Aotea. And you can see this green is covering everything. And that's pretty traditionally how we saw Caulerpa depicted in the media as well. This is in May 2023. This is the same area in March 25. And you can see Caulerpa is essentially gone from the seafloor and they're starting to slough off the piles. And then the most recent check, these images are from Auckland Council of that same area, September 2025. They couldn't find any Caulerpa at that location. So it kind of shows you we've finally got this awesome partnership, funding, people working together, tool development happening, and then Caulerpa goes, I'm out of here. It's just depicting kind of one of the challenges that we face and making sure we're still ready. And that's just some of the data from Earth Sciences report to show that in all of these sites, we saw that similar decline. So I think, I don't know, that kind of, the Caulerpa work kind of brings together the whole story. And I know I've gone a little bit over time, but I want to finish with this slide because I love fish, but also because it's one of my favorite images of kind of the chaos and density and diversity that we can see in some of our special places. So yeah, if you have any questions, fire away, but I'll also be here for the rest of the day. So yeah.
Surely there's a question.
No, that's all good. Yeah, go for it.
Just, do you happen to know or have a reason that an understanding is why Caulerpa is reduced?
I wish we could. We did So Earth Sciences New Zealand did see some work on this last year. It was pretty challenging because we kind of, by the time we'd gotten funding and contracts sorted for it, the decline was already kind of happening. They did look at a really big range of environmental variables, and there wasn't any kind of significant anomalies within those that would have explained it. We've got another 2 pieces of research that we're commissioning this year looking into the biomass reductions, but again, that's going to be pretty challenging after the fact. So no is a short answer. We're still seeing some Caulerpa in shallow areas on rocky reef. It's not completely gone, but we don't have any of those carpets that we saw early on in the incursion at all. Yeah.
I've got one.
Yeah.
So I think that the recommendation or the advice is that Caulerpa can't, or what generally won't establish in the top of the south because of temporary reasons. But with a warming climate, is there a risk that could establish in, you know, little pockets of the sounds or?
Yeah, so there was, I can't remember the exact metrics, but there was some research that was done by Auckland University on the temperature tolerances of 2 different species, and it definitely extended the kind of habitable range quite a long way down the coast. So Taranaki was well within the range of Caulerpa temperature ranges, just in case you're wanting to go into that space, Steve. So, but yeah, you get pockets of, because you've got shallow areas, you get protected pockets of warmer water here, and with climate change, I would never say no. We thought that Underia at the time you and I were working, everyone's like, oh, it won't go into Northland, it needs those kind of cold winters, and some of the harbours in Northland have huge populations of healthy Underia. And I think seaweeds are pretty adaptable and plastic, so they can adapt pretty quickly to new environments. So I would be keeping an eye out for it, especially in some of those kind of shallow, warm anchorages that people would go into. I guess you've got a couple of levels of connectivity removed, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out for the top of the south.